Good morning, everybody. I was watching the video along with you and making sure it was done before I started talking. But hey, it's great to be with you. This is Mark Gilbert, and thanks for joining us this Saturday morning or whenever you are watching it. It is a great honor for me to join the team here that is going through the Science of Mind each Saturday morning with you. This is the fifth week of the new year, and the previous 4 weeks, the prior speakers have gone through the Science of Mind's introduction, the four-part introduction. And today we delve into the actual first chapter of the book. And like I said, it's great to be with you and beginning in my first session with us. And I just want to stress to you that this is a conversation. And I want to thank you for watching and being along for the ride today and encourage you to comment. I see a couple of comments coming in already on the side. And welcome to Fiona and Roy. And thank you for being here. Today, like I said, we are looking at the first chapter of the Science of Mind textbook. If you've got your book and you want to follow along, you can get it out. We're going to be looking at pages 63 through 70, but I'm not going to be reading the whole thing to you. We're going to be discussing it and taking some time to go off on some tangents about it. So that hopefully that will make it deeper for you. So be sure to comment. And if you're watching this after it's recording, if you're watching it on the recording later on, I'd encourage you to put your comments as well. That helps other people who are maybe watching the video get to share in your wisdom. And also, I'll be monitoring the comments for a few days and reply to any that need replying to. So if you have a question, be sure and post it. So I'd encourage the folks who've come on today to also post their questions and comments as we go along. So that said, we're going to jump into this. And again, the chapter we're looking at this week is the actual first chapter in part one of the textbook. And it's the part one is entitled The Nature of Being, but the first chapter in chapter one is entitled In the Beginning, God, In the Beginning, God. Now, before we jump into the text, I just want to share a couple of comments about that title specifically. And one of the things is the phrase in the beginning. Of course, that harkens back to the phrase that begins the Christian Bible. And I think that was intentional on Holmes' part. The Bible starts with a creation story, and the Science of Mind, once you get beyond the four-part introduction and into this first chapter, it starts with a new thought creation story. And what I think Ernest intended here was to mirror the Bible to a degree by thinking about that very big question that comes up in a lot of our minds when we first are on the spiritual path. We're all anchored in those bigger questions of meaning. Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? And that sort of thing. And so I think Ernest, at the very beginning and the outset of this book, wanted to get into those points, into those questions. So the about the phrase in the beginning, one of the things that naturally we hear that and we think, oh, we're on this vast timeline. And you can sort of picture this because this is like the human experience, is that we are in the middle of time and that we have all the stuff that happened before us that we call the past and all the stuff that we imagine is going to happen in the future. And it's the future. And we're sort of riding along a timeline from moment to moment. And so when we hear in the beginning, our natural inclination is in this experience of time to jump back to the beginning of this timeline and say, where does the timeline actually start? And it's that point that we consider in the beginning. But Holmes had a different meaning for this. And before I get to Holmes' meaning, I want to suggest another thing for you to take away in terms of whenever you hear the phrase in the beginning, or if you hear the phrase once upon a time, which many of our fairy tales begin with those as well. But those phrases have a deeper meaning. Our natural human inclination is to say, going back to the beginning of our experience of time and the beginning point, or in once upon a time, somewhere in that vastness of the before aspect of our timeline. But I'd ask you to think about those phrases, and when you hear them, say, well, maybe that means not being on the timeline. Maybe that means transcending time itself, where you're sitting above the timeline and before time even existed, or in a state of the eternal, where it exists above and beyond the timeline. So in the very beginning, in the beginning, God means not only going back to see where did things actually start, but outside of it. So yes, Creation goes on forever, never ending, but always beginning, says Roy. And that's right. That's the other point that I wanted to make. And Holmes mentions that later on in the chapter, is that the process of creation is an ongoing process. That's the other thing that I think Holmes wanted to get here, is that the timeline has no beginning, it has no end. And outside of time, when we jump off the timeline for a minute and get into the eternal nature where there is no time, or into the state of the absolute that we'll be talking about in a little while, the very nature of creation is a continuing process. That it's not that the world and the universe and everything was created back at some beginning point. It's not just the Big Bang and then forward, but there is a process of creation that is occurring in every moment, continuously. So God has new beginnings. Conscious intelligence is creating in every moment. And that's one of the meanings that when you hear those phrases, I also want you to think of. It's not a beginning point where everything created, but it's a continuous process of creation that's ever going on, as Roy writes about in his comment. Very good. So let's get a little bit into the book. The very first thing when he gets into the content of the book is Holmes recognizes that all of us that are on the spiritual path, we begin our path by a number of questions that float up in our minds. Now here's Holmes' version of those seekers' questions. And I'm looking at the bottom of page 63, second paragraph there. It says, "In the beginning, God. In the beginning, spirit or intelligence only. No manifest universe. No system of planets. No visible form. Nothing but the life principle. God, the spirit, had not yet moved upon the waters. Then this all being moved or began to create." Here's his questions. Where did spirit move? Upon what did it move? From whence came its patterns? What means of power did it employ? Through what agencies did it work? In short, out of what is the world, ourselves included, made? How did we and all other physical manifestations come into being? I think most of us have asked those questions at one time or another. All of us have had questions of, why am I here? Why do humans exist? Why is this universe the way it is? And why does it work the way it does? When we stop and reflect upon our thoughts and reflect upon the world and our personal lives, the very first thing that comes up is there's these great mysteries that are behind the scenes, mysteries that are always calling us to deeper questions and seeking understanding. All great books, including the Bible and including the science of mind, begins with addressing the very nature of those first questions, which is, how did all of this come about? The Bible has its creation story. And Holmes says, we here in New Thought and with the science of mind have our creation story as well. Yes, as Roy puts in the comments, that there will always be a manifestation of divine ideas, that's a continuous process that is always going on. And we're always going on through looking at what is the deeper story that which we're living and how did this come about. So I want to make a couple of asides along the way. And part of this is just in terms of how to read Holmes. And some of you may already understand this, but I want to reflect upon the fact that the top of page 64, you'll notice in that first paragraph there, he decides to put all the words in all caps. Now, caps is an interesting thing when you're reading Holmes. Caps is when you come along and you're first reading Holmes, you're wondering, why the heck does he occasionally just capitalize words out of, it seems almost random when you're first reading it. But upon greater reflection, what you start to realize that whenever Holmes stops to capitalize a word, he's capitalizing something in the macrocosm of the bigness of the divine, of God, the infinite spirit, the oneness, the all that is behind and in and all. Whenever he's reflecting upon the all or God or spirit, he'll capitalize that to reflect that he's referencing it in the macrocosm of the divine bigness of everything that is. So that omnipresent and omnipotent, all-powerful essence that is behind everything is reflected by capitalizing the word. But when he goes to typing in all caps, It's almost like he's yelling at us. He's like saying, pay attention. This sentence is an interesting sentence. Just like my dog upstairs barking is emphasizing the very fact that this is an important point, that caps should be yelled at and they should be considered an important point for us to reflect upon. So what is he saying here on this page? He says, Spirit makes things out of itself through some inner act upon itself. Spirit makes things out of itself through some inner act upon itself. What does that mean? It means that everything is spirit and that everything that we experience as form is a manifestation that exists in spirit. And that's the stress. And Roy states that his Native American Navajo tribe has a creation story as well. And I think if you find most indigenous groups have a creation story. Most religions and faiths start with a creation story. And Holmes begins his book with a creation story. Now, I'm not going to read Holmes' creation story, but I would encourage you, if you've got a copy of the book, to do that. And it starts on page 64, goes over to the bottom of page 65, fairly lengthy. But I had this wild idea the other day when I was looking through this chapter and reading through that. And Holmes's words are perfect in and of themselves. And I got to thinking, how would I write the creation story? Given my study of Holmes and other New Thought influences, what would I describe the creation story as? And how would I put it in my own words? So I decided to do that. And so I wrote a creation story, and I'm going to read it to you. But it is if you want a copy of this, it's out on my website. My website is consciousbridge.com, consciousbridge.com. And I wrote a blog that went live this morning, which has my version of the creation story contained within it. Just a quick comment about this. I'm not trying to outdo or change Holmes. Holmes is perfect in and of itself. But what I'm trying to do is to say, what have I learned about this? And what if I were putting this in my own terms? Because a lot of times stopping to stop and teach something or to reflect upon it and put it in your own words makes it deeper for you. So my encouragement is to those of you who are hearing his words or anyone who reads the blog, you'll notice that the call is for you to stop and think, how would you put the creation story? How would you describe it? So bear with me for a few moments. I'm going to actually put my Science of Mind textbook down and read you what I wrote. And feel free as we go along to comment upon this or ask questions. I'm going to probably stop in the middle a couple of times and comment on it myself. But here is how I took Holmes's version, and I reflected upon what I feel is important and wrote what I call a creation story. It's not the creation story, but it's my take on it. So here you go. God, Spirit, the all, the thing itself, that ineffable something that is both beyond the limits of human understanding, but also intimately knowable at some level of our being, this divine essence decided, for purposes that we can only guess at, to create the manifest world which we experience. Prior to the creation of the manifest world, if there really was such a time, this Supreme Spirit was conscious only of itself. There would have been only this Supreme Spirit and its vast awareness. However, within the vastness of the all was a power to act upon its conscious thoughts and to bring them into form. These divine thoughts are often called the Word of God. The power that acts upon them is sometimes called the law, and the forms that are created are frequently described as the universe. Therefore, within the total completeness of God, we find everything we experience and everything we can imagine. God contains all thoughts, all powers, all manifest forms. Within God is this absolute state of infinite intelligence, eternal timelessness, and endless being. But also within God is this relative state of limited intelligence, the experience of time, and the ever-continuous movement of forms becoming. God, in its infinite conscious awareness, experiences it all. We may never know for certain why all of this occurs, but we can conjecture that God continuously creates the universe just to experience itself. I'm going to stop there for a moment. It goes on, but I want to reflect upon a couple of points. One is that every creation story begins with there must be something more than what we're experiencing. And there must be a creator, a form, an essence. One of the commonalities that, or aspects of the New Thought creation story that differs from the Christian creation story is in the concept of what God is. Obviously, God in the traditional Christian faith is a third party entity who exists outside of us and created this manifest form and often sits in judgment of us when we pass on from this state of form. An old man in the sky kind of picture that many of us know and have heard about. But of course, in New Thought, that's totally different. We envision God or spirit or the infinite intelligence to be something that is in everything, but beyond everything. It's not a person, but we can have a personal experience of it. It's an essence, a power, a force, a consciousness. It's hard to put words around it because in our humanness and our ability to, and our intellects to understand it, we can only understand it to a limited degree. So what we're called to do is to begin by understanding the essence of what the God really is or spirit is. And it's different from that traditional idea of God that we encounter out in most books in the world. The other thing that I want to stress is that we don't really know what God's intentions are. I'll do this occasionally. I'll make the mistake of trying to say, well, God wanted to do that. Well, how do I know what God wanted or how spirit wanted? It's hard for me to wrap my mind around, my own self, but to try to expand my consciousness into creating and understanding the intentions of the divine, as a degree of hubris to it. And is something I think that is beyond most of us. Occasionally I will slip up and say that, and I think many times people will try to conjecture. So I was trying to acknowledge that for me, we have ideas about why we think God created this. And the other point that I brought in there was regarding the fact that the world of the absolute and the world of the relative are all in and contained in God. So let me continue reading here. Bear with me. The divine thought of God that led to the initial creation of our manifest universe contained the idea of the forms that would eventually emerge. This is much like how a seed contains the ideas that grow into a tree. This method gives a general direction to what's coming forth while still allowing the introduction of flexibility and creative expression. Key point there is that when the manifest universe was created for whatever reasons, the idea or forms were already put into it, but not locked in so there's a degree of determinism, but a direction. But within that direction is the flexibility for us to express ourselves creatively, and all life to express itself creatively. So it's not an either or. A lot of times we want to say that. We want to say it's either deterministic or we have total free will. But there's a mixture there. And I think there is a sort of guidelines that were put in at the initial beginning. That's the point I was trying to make. Back to this. Hence, God's creation contained the ideas for the workings of a mechanical universe and the concepts for the potential emergence and evolution of the variety of life in ever-growing, more complex forms. These forms show up in the pattern of an overall upward trajectory of more intricate expression through the vast variability we see of plants and animals and leading eventually to humans. The point there is that the evolutionary urge and force was embedded in the manifest creation of the spirit at the beginning. Continuing. Embedded in that original divine thought of God was the creation of a distinct being who could and would grow into a relationship with God, a being that could respond and understand the divine spirit. On earth, that being evolved as the human. For this relationship to emerge, it was important that God place into its creation aspects of its own nature. As humans came to understand their own personal nature, they would also begin to recognize those characteristics and what they would come to see as their creator. Those human and divine qualities included a state of conscious awareness, an intelligence that could grow and develop, the ability to make free will choices, and the desire to be creative and express oneself. God's human creation was initially given a limited intelligence so that it forgot its divine source. Its ability to make free will choices also allowed it to deny its true unity with all that is. This has led to humans frequently making choices not in alignment with their true nature. Making such choices are considered to miss the mark of our ultimate reality and often called to sin. Despite this, God still considered its creation to be filled with goodness. Spirit knew that humans were implanted with its own divine characteristics, including the power of love and the ability to grow and evolve. The all realized that these divine attributes would ultimately urge humans along to the higher levels of their greater truth. Hence, they would know at the deepest levels of their being that they and every expression in the universe were one in God. Now, I had a fun putting that together because it made me stop and think, what do I really believe? And I would encourage you to do that. What do you really believe? And again, if you want to see the what I just wrote, it's available on a blog that's called A New Thought Creation Story, which is on my website, Conscious Bridge. But it's my take on what Holmes. I was reading Holmes and saying, how would I put that in my words? And how would I take my reflection upon what's going on? And there's a few things that I included, including concept of where we're going with evolution that I put into it. Holmes teaches about evolution, but his creation story per se doesn't really lock into it as much. But I really truly believe that in the essence and in the beginning and in the creation of the manifest universe was the urges that were put within us, the forms that allowed us to be creative, but also to move along in our evolution back to oneness with the divine. So that process that is in science of mind called involution, of course, where God or the spirit involved itself into its creation and allowed it to then creatively move back into expression and know itself and return home. Involution and evolution. And I think that's an important thing to anchor into the creation story, is the creation story has the seeds for where we're going. And it helps us understand life and give more meaning to it. So what do you think about that? Were parts that didn't understand? You have questions about it, be sure to drop a comment in the comment box either now or as you're watching the recording. But I think the very nature of going through the process of looking at what do I really believe about creation is an interesting one for us to do. It allows us to anchor in to what we believe. Now, I'm going to move on a little bit because I'm over on page 66 now, beyond Holmes' creation story. Here he gets into the concept of absolute intelligence. Absolute intelligence. And what do we mean by absolute? Well, it's hard to think of absolute without putting it also with the word relative. And in his text here, although he goes into that, we believe in an absolute intelligence because such an intelligence is manifest throughout the universe in which we live. A lot of times when you're reading Holmes and you encounter words, and this is for everything that we're doing throughout this series, and every time you're reading anything with Holmes, is to have handy your glossary. Have handy your glossary. Now, if you have a textbook, if you have one of the Science of Mind textbooks, obviously in the back is a glossary. And we can go back there and we can look up. There are words, and I've done this, and you can do this on your own, but there are the words absolute, and there are the words relative. And then there's actually some phrases in here that gets into the combining the relative and the absolute. And as he thumbs through to find the right page, he has it on page 627, relativity and absoluteness. Relativity and absoluteness. Now, I encourage you can read those on your own. I'm not going to go through the definitions, but, and this is a key point when you're studying Holmes, I would encourage you to also, if you're adding to your Science of Mind library, to pick up a copy of what he calls New Thought Terms, the Dictionary of New Thought Terms. And this content is also contained in a little smaller version called New Thought Dictionary. These two books, essentially, even though they're smaller and have a different title on them, they're the same book on the inside. And what he's done is take many of the same terms that are in the glossary of the Science of Mind and put them into these books. And sometimes there's words that are in these smaller books that are not in the glossary of the Science of Mind. And sometimes there are words that are in the glossary that are not in here. But this gives you a more fuller idea. And sometimes I find the meanings in here to resonate with me a little bit more. And I am going to jump to one, just as we're talking about absolute and relative. Well, let's first I'm going to go to absolute for a moment. Absolute and relative. The absolute, the God principle, the supreme, the unknowable, the unthinkable, the unmanifest. In other words, the absolute is another word for God or spirit or that thing that ineffable, something that we can't really wrap our minds around. So the absolute is, in a sense, it's beyond, it's off the timeline I was talking about. It's eternal. It's includes everything. It includes the all of time. But that's that state that's beyond everything. The relative is is that which is relative to the absolute. And here he says absolute and relative refers to the unconditioned cause and may affect which it may project. It refers us back to the word relative. And I thought that this was a great definition. Again, I'm looking at this book. Relative and absolute. He says the absolute is the universal intelligence and law ever giving birth to form. The form is relative, since its entire existence depends upon itself, not upon itself, but upon something else. Now, if you're familiar with science of mind and you know the teaching symbol, or how we talk about the fact that the universe and the all that is, can be broken into three aspects of it: the divine intelligence, the law, and the manifest universe. What he is saying here is that the absolute is universal intelligence and law. It's the top two areas of the science of mind teaching symbol, if you want to think of it that way. And the relative is the bottom area, the world of form. So anything that is beyond the world of form is in the world of the absolute. Now, here's a learning for you. And again, if you have questions on any of this, post your comments and questions in the comment field. And Holmes writes about this later, but this was hammered recently when I was reading a book called The Kabbalion, written under the name Three Initiates, but it's really by a New Thought author called William Walker Atkinson. In that, it has a hermetic principle called the principle of polarity. And in that book, it states the fact that the absolute and the relative are not either or. They're on a sliding scale. They're on, if we move up the scale a little bit, we're moving from absolute to relative. If we're moving up, we're going from relative to absolute. If we're going down the scale, we're going from absolute to relative. What I want you to wrap around in your minds is that we live in the relative world with all this stuff around us, but we're also in the absolute world. Many talks I like to reference that and we know the words of Teilhard de Chardin, where he famously said we're spiritual beings having a human experience. What we want to wrap around is the idea that we live simultaneously in two worlds, that we have one foot in the spiritual world, the absolute world, and we have one foot in the material world. And we put different weights in different moments into those two spheres. That the manifest creation and all of the evolutionary aspect of the plants and animals was essentially in the world of the relative. But humans crossed an interesting threshold when they became self-aware, and they started living in both realms, the realm of the absolute with the divine and the relative. And back to the hermetic concept in the Kabbalion, it's not flipping, it's moving up a sliding scale, a polarity, moving from relative to absolute. And what we're called to do is in our daily affairs is to live in the world of the relative. It's real as form, as Holmes puts it. It's not that it's not real, but in our limited consciousness and in our evolutionary process, we're interacting in the world of form, but we're also interacting in the world of spirit and moving ever upward towards it. And so in this description of the absolute, what Holmes is getting into is the fact that we need to anchor our awareness of these two realms and how we live in there. He says, and I'm reading from the bottom of page 66, creation means the giving of form to the substance of mind or spirit. Spirit being all and only, there is nothing for it to change into but itself. Everything is spirit, everything is God, everything is the divine. But Holmes also writes that thoughts are form in liquid. That what we experience as the world of form, when it's not in form, is also contained in the divine in a liquid state. You can sort of imagine it like an ocean where blocks of things get frozen into a certain shape. And it's a great visual for anchoring in the idea that in the world of the absolute, the ideas of form and how they're going to be created can get locked into a form like a block of ice. And then they melt and they're back in. And so there's a continuous state and flow. So what is the law, Roy asked, and how can we briefly describe that? The law, I don't know if I can put it in one word, Roy, but the law is the creative aspect of the divine. It's that part of the divine, of the absolute, that takes the thought of God and then makes it manifest into the world of form. It's the part that acts upon. Now, there's more to the definition as you got into the textbook, but how we're referencing it in this moment is that aspect of God that takes the fluid substance of thought and takes that thought and anchors it into the form that's created into the manifest world. Now, this gets to the next point that we have in the textbook that I'm going to jump over to. And by the way, the point that Roy made earlier and the point that we were making up front about in the beginning God and how that's a process of ever continuing, just want to call attention to that on the top of page 67 in the middle of the paragraph there. He says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth does not refer to a time when there was no creation, but rather to the process of eternal creation. In the beginning is occurring all the time. There's new beginnings in every moment of our existence. On the bottom of 67 and rolling over the top of 68, Holmes gets into something that says that what has been the realization of the deep thinkers of all time. So we're looking on the top of 68 now. The deep thinkers of antiquity, as well as the philosophers of all ages, have meditated long and earnestly upon the nature of the divine being, knowing that there could be but one ultimate reality back of all things. They have pondered deeply as to the nature of reality, and it is significant that most of the great thinkers have arrived at similar conclusions. Most of the great thinkers have arrived at similar conclusions. What are those conclusions? They're listed sort of, you have to pick them out as he goes through the text in the following few paragraphs. But I'll tell you in essence what he's saying. The great thinkers have said, everything is one. All seeming change, everything we experience as change, is occurring within the one. And how that change occurs is a nature of an interaction that is referenced three ways: the voice of God, the thought of God, or the word of God. So whenever we hear the voice of God, the word of God, thought of God, we're talking about the essence within the spirit, everything that all it is, the thing that is creating the creative force, the thing that starts the motion. But then all of the motion, including the force, the law, and the manifestation of it, is all occurring within spirit. It's all occurring within the one. What seems like the world of the relative is just our limited experience of life. The more that we can become aware of the vast oneness of life, the more our thoughts have power, and the more we are evolving to the higher truth of who we are, of recognizing our oneness. Okay. So that's the important thing to do. Now, Holmes then goes on to stress thought. And if you look over on page 69, he gets into the idea that thought seems to mean more to us than any other term. In this connection, in talking about the creative aspect, more than the word or the voice, the thought, it seems to cover the meaning better, for we know that thought is an inner process of consciousness. The thought of God must be the cause of all that really exists. And as there are many existing things, there must be many thoughts in the mind of the infinite. This is logical to suppose, for an infinite mind would necessarily conceive an infinite variety of ideas. Hence, the world of multiplicity, or many things. But the world of multiplicity does not contradict the world of unity. For the many live in the one. This concept of unity is the mystical secret of the ages, the key to spiritual wisdom, and the teaching of Jesus. Probably beyond this, the idea of thoughts about the creation story, this chapter's stressing is the idea of understanding this nature of the relative and the absolute, and the very nature that in the world of the absolute, allness is the world of the relative. We interact day to day in this material physical world and tend to think this is real and this is the vast reality. And it's real for us as far as the real of experience and moving through form is. But why spiritual practices are important for us, why it's important for us to do affirmations and meditations and affirmative prayer and anything else, it moves us up that sliding scale. It moves us into the state of recognizing and knowing the state of the absolute. It's in that state that we start to recognize that if everything is one, then all aspects of being, everything, again, how I put it in my write-up, everything that we experience and everything we can imagine is within the divine, everything. And it's the more we can expand our consciousness to see that, accept that, and know that, the more that we're going to grow and evolve. Now, the rest of this chapter gets into a topic called volition. Volition. And he says there is but one volitional factor in the universe, and this is spirit, or the self-knowing mind. God did not make God. This is self-evident. God did not make law. Law is co-eternal with God. God did not make substance. This is also coexistent and co-eternal with God. Did you get that? Consciousness, law, the creative force, and manifest forms, substance. They're all coexistence with the divine. They're all in it. But God did make and does make, and again, it's all caps here, so he's yelling this at us. But God did make and does make and is making and will continue to make from eternity to eternity forms. We live in a universe of infinite substance and numberless forms, wherein nothing is moved unless intelligence moves it in accordance with law. Volition is the ability to make a conscious choice. And in this section, Holmes writes that infinite spirit, the self-knowing mind, is the one volitional factor in the universe. So the question then becomes, well, doesn't it feel like we can make choices? Don't we have volition? Don't we have the power to change our thoughts and hence change our lives? Can I not choose to do A rather than B? Feel like I'm moving through a life where I have volition. But Holmes is saying only spirit, the self-knowing mind, has volition. How can it be that I feel that I have that power? What do you think? Do you have volition? And why do you have volition? Well, the answer lies in the fact that the divine qualities of spirit reside within its creation. That the divine, in creating humans, in order, and again, I'm guessing, conjecturing, because we can't really know, in order for the divine to have an experience within itself, in order to communicate and interact with some aspect of itself for the very experience of the creative expression, the divine embedded its creation with its divine characteristics. So where the all-knowing spirit has the ability to choose, it embedded in humans that ability as well. That we have volition. We have the ability to choose and to interact with the life and to create the lives we want. So I'd invite you as homework for this week to go back and read Holmes' creation story. And then think about your own creation story. Go read mine off the website with the links that were given. Reflect upon what your thoughts are on the divine essence and where we're going and how you think all of this came about. Reflect upon the big questions of life and ask yourself, why do I exist and where are we going? And then write out your own creation story. And if you don't write it, at least reflect upon the questions enough so that it gives you guidance for your life and where you're going. I want to thank everybody for being a part of today's presentation. And let me look at the last comment here. I have Roy writes, and thank you, Roy, for your comments while we've been interacting today. I have volition because I have the freedom to choose. Otherwise, I'd be like a robot, no independence to think. And that's very true. I think we all experience that. You know, I think we recognize that we do not live in a deterministic universe, that we do have this free will choice. We do have volition. And this is where I think all of us are called, and why we're here, or even studying this, is to recognize and tap into the power of our own volition so that we can create the best lives for ourselves. Where are you going? Ultimately, you're returning to the divine in your awareness. You're returning to an ultimate state of knowing that you are a child of God who is reflecting that God intelligence and abilities. And the more that we understand that at the deepness of our soul, the more we bring happiness, prosperity, and peace and all things good to our lives. I want to thank you all for being with us this morning. Hopefully this has been of benefit. Again, if you're viewing it on the video, be sure and drop a comment and I'll be monitoring it. And I thank you for your time and your interest in this topic. Blessings.
Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Denver, for your continued support. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Midtown Atlanta, for your monthly contribution. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living North Jersey, for your monthly contribution. And please help us welcome Om Center for Spiritual Living in La Mesa, California. Thank you for your monthly donation. Thank you, Center for Spiritual Living Seattle, for your most generous donation. And a special thanks to Hefferland Foundation for your generous technology grant. And Suze Ogden, thank you for your very generous donation. And a big shout out to all our committed donors.